evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming to tonight's event. Frome Stop Wars campaign is very honoured this evening to be hosting a man of immense courage and integrity, former SAS soldier Ben Griffin. Ben is accompanied tonight by some members of Veterans for Peace UK. That's an organisation that Ben founded in 2011. Now, why do I say Ben is a man of immense courage and integrity? Just a bit of his story, and he'll fill you in on this. He served in the parachute regiment in Northern Ireland, Macedonia and Afghanistan. He then joined the SAS and he was deployed to Baghdad in 2005. In Baghdad, he fought alongside US forces, and it was there in Iraq that he saw things that as he says, were illegal or just wrong. So this is when he had this momentous, life-changing and courageous decision to make, and that was not to return to service in Iraq. It was very courageous because he fully thought that he would be incarcerated and court-martialed. Luckily, Ben's exemplary military record stood him in good stead, and his commanding officer allowed him to leave the army, saying, and I quote, that Ben was a balanced and honest soldier who possesses the strength and character to genuinely have the courage of his convictions. Now, for more insights into the realities and the nature of war, I'd like to introduce the members for Veterans for Peace and, of course, Ben Griffin himself. Ben.
I always start this with any talk. Can you put your hands up if you're a veteran in the audience of the Army, Navy, Air Force, Army Cadet Force, anything? Yeah, okay. What I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to give a talk, and it really is, I suppose, one man's perspective, one man's experience into the realities of the military life and modern warfare, to try and give you an insight, maybe an insight that you might not have seen in the mainstream media, an insight that you might not have seen in war films. So I'm going to tell a bit about my own story, move on to some experiences in Iraq, talk about Veterans for Peace, and then we'll open it up to some questions. We've also got members of Veterans for Peace here who might be able to answer questions that I'm unable to. This evening we've had first meeting of Veterans for Peace within the Southwest. So we've got about 20 to 30 members down this way, but it's the first time they've all got together in one place, and they've decided to set up a branch of Warminster, which I think is a great development. So, you know, where did this all start? Well, I suppose I was maybe a strange child. I had a fascination with the military from a very early age, and I can't even remember where this started. But I remember from an early age demanding that my parents only brought me green clothes, that my granddad made me weapons out of pieces of MDF and bolted old-fashioned bolts onto there for me to pretend it was a Lee Enfield. And when I was a child, I was obsessed with Remembrance Sunday. Probably the only person under 10 who actually watched those parades on the TV. I was fascinated with the veterans, and these were mostly World War I veterans when I was a young boy. Their medals, the stories, and all of these things started to capture my imagination. I moved on to reading commando book comics, these sort of like tiny little comic books, half-sized comic books. And the stories within those comic books were usually British soldiers fighting against the Japanese, fighting against the Germans. And the common theme was that the British soldiers were the good guys, that the Japanese and the Germans did terrible things to people, and that we were the people who behaved ourselves but also defeated the bad guys. This was a common theme through those comic books, and sort of, I suppose, a common theme through the sort of the fantasies I had as a child. I remember watching many war films on a Sunday afternoon, and these films, you know, the sort of Second World War films, the classic ones, you know, The Longest Day, Bridge Too Far, things like this. And this only reinforced in me this sense that Britain was this great country that protected freedom, that stuck up for other countries, and defeated countries that were doing terrible things. I remember as a young boy, my grandfather was a former, he'd started in the Navy before the Second World War. He'd served a full career, and one of the main things that me and my cousins used to do on a weekend when we were up there was badger him into showing us his medals, you know. And I didn't twig on at the time that this man kept these medals, and there were quite a lot of them, in a battered old envelope stuffed in a drawer. And I didn't really think about why that might be. And we used to badger him about these medals, but it was only on about 2 or 3 occasions that he actually got these medals out. And I also remember asking him when I was a kid, watching these remembrance parades, "Oh, Grandad, why don't you wear a poppy?" Or "Why don't you go to church for the remembrance parade?" And he said to us, "You know, I don't go to church on any other Sunday, why would I go now?" But I didn't really pick up on this, didn't really pick up on the reticence to show us the medals or the lack of involvement in these parades, you know, and these things were just seeping into me all the time. Most of my uncles were in the military, my cousins were in the military. When I was at school, I then started to read a lot of military history. I was interested in all sorts of warfare. I was interested in the experiences of soldiers. I was even allowed out of lessons to go to the library and read these books. I don't know why, but who knows. And so this kind of carried on throughout childhood, and I suppose I had a sort of dalliance with wanting to be a professional footballer, you know, like a lot of kids do. And then when I got to the age of 13, a couple of kids in my class said, "Oh, have you heard about the Army Cadet Force?" And I was kind of aware of this organisation, but didn't know where it was, didn't know that I was allowed to join it. And for anyone who doesn't know, the Army Cadet Force is a militarised youth organisation paid for entirely by the Ministry of Defence. And so I turned up. You know, if you go to a state school, the Army Cadet Force is run outside of school. And straight away I was impressed with this organisation. You got given a uniform. When I was in the Army Cadets, it was all male. You got given a uniform, you got taught how to march up and down. And the instructors who were in charge of us, who were probably, you know, in their 20s but seemed a lot older at the time, they treated us like adults. So at school we were constantly told what to do, you know, constantly kicked out of lessons, told off. And in the Army Cadet Force we were encouraged. We were also allowed to smoke, swear, and on the odd occasion we were allowed to get drunk, you know, and what other youth organisation offers that? It was the Army Cadet Force that gave me a practical appreciation of military life. It turned out that I really liked the practicalities of soldiering. I liked being cold. I liked being wet. I liked having to carry these big packs. I liked following orders, which was really strange because at school I hated being told what to do, but for some reason, in that military context, I really enjoyed being told, given something to do, and then meeting that task. And something else that really sort of captured me was the physicality of it. You were being tested on how you could perform physical tasks. And school was nothing like that. So, you know, even if it was something basic like marching or shooting or map reading, these were all things that were physical that you just weren't tested in other ways, in other parts of, you know, childhood or, you know, young adulthood. After a short while in the Army Cadets, I got promoted, and then you get to boss the other kids around, you know, and from that point onwards I was sold, you know. What other organisation can you boss other kids around? So I started to concentrate more and more on the Army Cadet Force. I was still in school, but I knew that it didn't really matter what I did in school. The Army was going to let me in. So I carried on with the Army Cadet Force. When I got to the age of 16, a lot of my mates joined the Army, but I was probably the smallest, skinniest kid in my year. And I knew, having gone on these army camps and seen regular soldiers, that there was no way I was going to hack it at the age of 16. I was just too sort of small and fragile. So I stayed on in school. I did my A-levels more to waste some time than actual any interest in them. And then when I got to 18, I left school and I felt that I was physically able to join the military. Now, people often ask me, and it is true, you know, what are the accents you hear in the military? And, you know, the majority of the accents you hear in the military are Scottish, Welsh, Irish, the southwest, you know, the north. And there's an obvious reason for that. These are areas where there are fewer jobs, higher unemployment, maybe the wages, if you can get a job, the wages aren't as good. So there are many people within the military who are economic recruits. And later on in my career, and since I've left, I've met many soldiers who served in the United States military whose only reason for joining the military was for economic reasons. They were offered the GI Bill, which means that the American military will pay for you to go to university. Not only will they pay the course fees, they'll pay you a wage whilst you're in there. So there is definitely a phenomenon, you know, and a lot of people are caught up in this, of the economic recruit. However, myself and the guys that I ended up serving with, I would call recruits. No one had to twist my arm to go down the recruiting office. In fact, people had to try and stop me from going down there. When I got into the recruiting office, I told them straight away I want to join the parachute regiment. And he said, oh, why don't you do this test? You might be able to do something better. And I was like, no, that's what I want to join. I don't think I even looked at how much money you got paid, or the leave, or any of the working conditions. None of that mattered to me at all. And so when it was 19 by the time I joined the parachute regiment, and we were sent up to Lichfield. And on the first day, I was in a room quite a bit smaller than this, a little classroom. There was 35 of us. And an old captain walked in. He must have been about 55. And he looked around the room, shaking his head, and he said, only 8 of you are going to pass. And I looked around the room, and I looked at all the other people in the room, all the other, you know, I suppose boys really, but, you know, young men. And I was thinking, wow, this is going to be tough, because a lot of these people looked bigger, stronger, tougher than me. And he was right. At the end of that training, there were only 8 of us left. But I learned through that training that actually doesn't really, you know, a certain amount of physical fitness is important in the military, but it's actually the main thing that gets you through is an ability to hack things, to just carry on, no matter what's thrown at you, no matter how cold, no matter how wet, hungry, no matter how much you get shouted at, it's just to carry on. And the people who got through this course were the people who just carried on. But I want to talk a little bit about what happened in that training. And in some ways, this is looking back at it, you know, in hindsight, rather than what I thought was happening at the time. We hear a lot in the news today about the military ethos, and how the military ethos is something that we should ingrain into our schools. And if you ask a politician or a colonel to tell us what that military ethos means or what its components are, you'll usually get some bland answers. Maybe it's about teamwork or discipline, or who knows, yeah, teamwork and discipline seem to be the main things that I can remember hearing from those mouths. But looking back on it, you know, the military training I went through was probably at the extreme end of what happens to recruits when they join the military. You know, if you joined as a chef, the training is going to be a lot different to if you join as a para. But the military ethos that was sort of imbued into us was a little bit different to what the politicians and the colonels are talking about. And I think it can boil down into 3 components. And the first one of those components is to follow orders without question. The primary aim of the soldier, to follow orders without question. And the way we were trained ensured that we went from civilians who would question authority all of the time, mothers, teachers, you know, people in the street, to people who would follow orders in an instant without engaging our brains. And this was done in many ways, but just to give one of the examples that was used again and again, was through fear of physical punishment. So we'd come from schools where if you'd made a mistake, the individual was punished. And we'd gone into a system where if an individual made a mistake, the group was punished. So we were operating in an environment of group punishment. And any mistake was punished severely. So anyone who hesitated to follow an order, that was clamped down on straight away. Anyone who failed to follow an order, so if you were told to carry out a task and you didn't carry it out properly, that was punished. And some of the punishments that we were subjected to on a regular basis were, you know, maybe taken out on a run, taken to a massive hill, where we'd be run up and down the hill, carrying each other on our shoulders, or carrying each other in a baby carry, until we were sick. And through this process, of fearing the physical punishment, but